Why don't the poor in a democratic system vote themselves even more from the public till and thus eliminate income inequality? Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. You know, guys, there's a professor writing in the Washington Post. His name is Daniel Treisman, Treisman, a UCLA professor of political science, who marvels that the poor don't do more at the ballot box and by whom they elect to soak the rich. Because, of course, you know, the major problem during the Obama administration, we became aware of it for the first time, is income inequality. And he thinks that the reason why they don't do this, Bill and Steve, is that they think that they would be hurt by it. It's not because the trickle down would dry up if they tax the rich too much. It's rather that the poor think they're about average. They don't realize that they're poor, and therefore they think that tax hikes would hurt them personally because they figure they're probably making decent money. The professor actually shows some studies where people widely underestimated the average income of Americans. In other words, we suffer from Lake Wobegon syndrome, which is we all think we're average. So, Stephen Green, does this sound like a plausible theory to you? I mean, do you think there may be other reasons why low-income people don't mass at the polls, and you know that they don't vote in great numbers, and they don't overwhelmingly support the redistributionists among us?
Well, the fact is there aren't enough poor people in the United States to do that.
That's an excellent point.
We have a dearth of poor people? Are you suggesting we need more poor people so we can elect more Democrats?
The poverty rate is what? It hovers kind of between 15 and 18%, depending on the state of the economy, and that's not enough people to win an election. Well, except where Democrats rule and they just count up how many votes they need. But more seriously, there aren't enough poor people to do that because this is such a dynamic and wealthy country. And when you actually look at the poverty rate, the 15 to 18%, that does not include transfer payments. That, in other words, welfare, Medicaid, these things aren't included in how we calculate our poverty rate. And when you actually look at the number of people who are really poor, like hungry, don't know where they're going to live or where their rent money is going to come from poor, that is a vanishingly small fraction of the electorate. So where the money really is, of course, is in the middle class, and the middle class is already getting sucked. We've got a progressive income tax that hits various people in the middle class at various heights. You've got your state income tax in most places. You've got a sales tax everywhere. You've got property tax everywhere. You pay tax on your gasoline. We are already paying so many taxes, and it's supposed to come back to us in these middle class benefits, and they do.
Now,
so
Steve, I don't want to interrupt you.
We already have this set up.
I don't want to interrupt you from trying to cheer us all up with this litany of taxes, but the point isn't. The point is that the author is making here isn't that there aren't enough poor people to make a difference. What he's marveling at is that let's just say it's only 10% or 5% of the population or whatever the percentage is, but even they who have the right to vote do not show up in vast numbers to vote. And when they do, they really aren't disproportionately one way or the other. So they're not overwhelmingly voting for the redistributive Democrats necessarily. It's like, why don't they realize that they have the power of the vote and that they could be much more active in that?
Okay, I'll give you the short answer. It's because even our poor people are kick-ass Americans. That's why.
Okay, I can buy that. Bill Whittle, it seems clear from the column in the Washington Post that the author thinks that in order to win the battle of income inequality, the left has to do a better job of convincing Americans that, in fact, they are not average, that they are much worse than that. They're below average. Do you think that's a campaign, a messaging campaign that could work? And what do you think the counter message should be?
Well, God knows that we've got to find a way to avoid the catastrophe of having people vote themselves huge amounts of money out of the Treasury, because that would be, the end of the world. So let's just start with Professor Treason. Did you say his name?
Close enough.
He's Trees man or Trees person, or Trees individual.
start with the fact that pretty much on any given year, $2 trillion of wealth is essentially redistributed across the board in this country in the form of entitlements and various other things through taxation into entitlements. That's $2,000 billion every single year. That's already happening. So what he's really
But Bill,
saying
he's saying
is,
they could have it
why
all.
don't we don't take more? That's right. That's exactly right. So there's a couple things here. First of all, to go to Steve's answer, the reason that it doesn't happen is that the average person in America has a much higher moral fiber than this professor at UCLA. That's number one. That's number one. That's the beginning of it. Number two, we have to ask ourselves a question, and this isn't simple sophistry. It is in fact the essence of the question. If you have any society and you break it down into quadrants or whatever you want to call it, you're going to have a bottom fifth or a bottom tenth or whatever it is, right? Let's just say the bottom 10% in terms of income are the poor of that country. But you could basically take them away and fly them to the moon, and you would still now have a new bottom tenth. And the point I made probably 10 years ago, that in the Billionaires Club, the guy with $900 million is the chump that serves the coffee, right? I mean, to say you are going to eliminate poverty means that you are going to eliminate any income difference at all, because American poor people are richer than 93% of the people in the rest of the world. On some people, I think on some level, Steve knows that when he gave his answer. But I think to get to the direct point of why people don't vote themselves more money is because we still have residually in this country a realization of the fundamental truth of this country. When you were a poor person, prior to the invention of America, really, if you were poor in Britain in 1740 and you were a tanner in a village, and the earl was born into wealth in the mansion, and you were born into the village, and you had to malud your way out of the room whenever he arrived, that's genuine injustice, and that deserves a remedy, and the remedy is America. I'm certainly not naive enough or cold-hearted enough not to accept the reality that people are born into different stations in life, that they're born into hugely different starting conditions. And there's nothing anyone can do about that. But in America, we've devised a system that is, certainly until recently, was based on merit and allows not only, this is the thing that nobody talks about, it not only allows people to move up, it also allows people to move down. You look at the history of this vast wealth that we've got to go soak so we can distribute to everybody else, which basically means I'm going to take it from them and give to me, by the way, because when you talk to young people about selling their cell phones or their Xboxes to distribute that to the poor, all of a sudden they're William F. Buckley. So a lot of people are about this whole idea of wealth redistribution as long as it's somebody else's wealth coming to me, but when it's time for my wealth to go to somebody else, then all of a sudden they change their perspective. But when you look at the history of this kind of, baronial kind of wealth in America, what you find is, in the case of Andrew Carnegie or in the case of Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, you start with people who are essentially born with essentially nothing, who hard work and effort and ingenuity and all the rest become extremely wealthy. Yeah. And then what you find is the business gets handed down to the second generation, and the second generation maintains the fortune. They don't grow it, they don't come up with anything new, they consolidate it and then maintain it. And then the third generation begins to really just basically piss it away. And by the time you're in the fourth generation, you've got people who've been on trust funds their entire lives, and they're borrowing money for cheeseburgers and cocaine, right? I mean, it goes up and down. And I think the final thing I'll say about this is what Ben Carson said, and that's simply this. He said, yes, I have a couple of houses. Yes, I've got a nice car or two. And he said, you could take all of that away from me, and in 6 months, I'll have it back again, because what I have is up here. And this, you do not have to be a brain surgeon for that to be true. You could take all of the wealth in America right now, divide it equally among everybody, and in a year or two, if people didn't change their habits, you would see the same breakdown of wealth that we see today, because it's not about IQ, race, birth, or anything. It's about actions and habits. It's about decisions.
Yeah, Bill, to give you that example I promised during the backstage, I learned from my German teacher. After World War II, Germany was smashed. Just, the country was destroyed. West Germany I'm talking about now, because East Germany stayed communist. But in West Germany, they gave everybody 20 marks after the war and said, go out there. And by the time the economic miracle was taking place in the late 50s, pretty much everybody that had been poor before the war was still poor, and pretty much everybody that had been middle class and lost everything in the war was middle class again, and the rich, of course, were rich again.
I have to hammer this. I have to hammer this. I'm sorry, Scotty. But what he said is so important. It just reminded me of an example I saw with my own eyes growing up. In Miami in the 70s, when I got there in the early 70s, there were large numbers of Cuban refugees who were fleeing this equalization program where you get to vote yourself as much money and everybody gets the exact same amount as everybody else, which is nothing except for Fidel, who has $900 million when he dies. But let's put that aside for a second. What you found in Miami, I saw this all the time, was you found people fleeing political oppression, and you would see actual, no joke, brain surgeons, heart surgeons who did not have licenses in America, and they basically were working as shopkeepers and sweeping floors, took out a loan, usually from relatives, where they'd all pool their money, bought a little store, ran that store with the family, didn't pay themselves anything other than their own rent, turned that into 2 stores, turned that into 5 stores, turned that into 100 stores, and now they're wealthy again. Because this is not there's nothing genetic or anything about it. It's a simple attitude. The guys that used to be brain surgeons became brain surgeons by working hard, being married, treating their kids with respect and maintaining an eye on them and teaching them to work hard. The whole family pulled together and they became rich again. I saw it time and time and time again.
It's a really twisted story that these income inequality champions or opponents, however you want to look at it, like this professor from UCLA, weave for themselves. Because essentially almost all of the people who are railing against the pandemic of income inequality are all in the upper middle class or beyond. And so they're all people who have been accidentally blessed with wealth. So they've just stumbled into it somehow. It's fallen to them by no fault of their own. And so they have all this wealth. And I think what they misunderestimate about the poor is that when the poor man in downtown Detroit or wherever else sees a guy drive by in a Mercedes, he doesn't think to himself, that rotten SOB, I'm going to steal his money. Instead, he looks at him and says, I wonder how I can get me a Mercedes-Benz as well. He looks at him and says, I would like to be that guy. I aspire to be that guy. And I think that's why politicians who go preaching the gospel of socialism to the poor don't get the kind of response that they would expect. It's certainly, they may get it in the cheering of a crowd if they run an event that has, Bruce Springsteen performing, but they don't get it at the polls because the people just don't show up to vote for that, because at the heart of it, that's not what America is about. America may not have it may not be the case that everybody in America who wants to rise above where they are now actually does so. But the truth that Bill was talking about is the opportunity is there. Somebody's going to comment on this show and they're going to go, that Bill Whittle, he doesn't know what he's talking about, because there is much more stasis among the socioeconomic groups in the United States than there are in some other countries. People aren't really rising up in rags to riches stories. That's not the point. It's not the point whether somebody actually does it or not. The point is there an obstacle to that is institutionalized or is in place by act of law that is preventing people from doing that? And the answer to that is no. And I think that's where professors like this guy from UCLA don't understand. Income inequality is not the issue for poor people. They don't think that guy has money and I don't, I'm angry at him. They think, I'd like more money too. What is it that he did? How can I learn from him? They don't think that if you're rich, then their poverty, you're to blame for their poverty. They just think, wow, look, there's an opportunity. I'm sorry that I'm in the position that I'm in, but I have an opportunity to rise. And I really believe Steve is right. I think that the moral fiber of America's poor is better than these leftist professors give it credit for. And I also think that the reason why the Democrats have been less than successful in pushing the Bernie Sanders philosophy of life is because poor people in America are still Americans. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.
And Bernie has 3 houses.
And his son is running for office.